a morir. Mestiza soy, con traducción atroz voy, con cuatro colores del maíz.
Oh, hello, I'm Miguel, and welcome to the first episode of You Are Probably a Racist. Today I'm going to be speaking about the Latino vote. So, those who follow politics tend to understand that Cubans, who tend to be more in Florida, vote differently than the rest of the Latino communities in the United States. And I'm going to talk about why that is and why, and even complicate it even further. So, many white Americans liberal white Americans were shocked that so many Latino Americans had voted for Trump. So exit polls showed anywhere between 18 and 39%. 39% is probably way too high. It's probably more around 20%. So you're looking at almost a quarter of Spanish-speaking Americans voted for Donald Trump, which seemed to be, voting against their own interests. But we have to look at past elections, and the gap that Hillary, as far as Latino voters that Hillary Clinton had with Trump, was actually narrower than past elections. Obama, for example, had a lot more Latino votes than Hillary, is what I'm saying. And so I kind of want to address that a little bit. So let's talk about Cubans. In 1966, the U.S. passed a law called the Cuban Adjustment Act. And what that did, it allowed Cubans to become permanent residents within a year of them arriving to the United States. And the way it was handled is, as soon as they left Cuba and they were in the ocean, if they were picked up by a vessel and then brought to the U.S., they didn't have to go back to Cuba for most part, unless they're criminals of some sort. And then that changed. That was reinterpreted in 1995 under Bill Clinton's administration, and what became known as wet feet, dry feet. So what that meant was that if you're found on the ocean and picked up, or if you were found in the ocean, you were really prohibited from landing on Florida. And those who remember the mid-90s to late 90s, remember military ships forcing people away, people dying and drowning because of that. But this new interpretation was that if a Cuban left, and as soon as their feet landed on the soil, so their feet were wet in the ocean, dry on the sand, they could become residents within a year. Under Obama, that changed again, and also under Obama, a Democrat president, he lifted some of the sanctions off of Cuba, which upset many Cubans. So Cubans left Cuba because of their communist government. So anything in their mind that looks like it's approaching communism, they're going to vote against. So that's why they tend to vote Republican and not Democrat, with Democrats usually wanting more social networks to catch people who are on the margins. And also, we have to remember during the 50s and the Cold War and Russia and Cuba and everything, there are other dictators who were from Latino American countries who were as bad, if not worse than Fidel, but they didn't get the same treatment. We can see a similar thing now with Venezuelans, who also tend to congregate in Florida. So this is my own observation, my own hypothesis that I'm going to share with you. I haven't heard it anywhere else, but it seems to have the most explanatory power for what we see. So Venezuelans, a lot of them left Venezuela when Hugo Chavez was president. So when I did my Mormon mission in 1992, to be honest, I was Spanish-speaking stateside. I was in Dallas. I can only remember meeting one family from Venezuela. There weren't a lot. Most were Mexicans, followed by Guatemalans and El Salvadorians, and I knew of one Cuban family. So they flee. And why did they flee? Well, because Hugo Chavez was gaining more power. Things were becoming more and more socialized, and he was starting to have tendencies which leaned towards Marxism and Leninism, and that's frightened a lot of people. So they fled, and a lot of them landed in Florida. So once again, they left because of the government. And once again, in the Venezuelan mind, if anything appears to be headed towards socialism or worse, communism, they're going to vote against that. It's just a reaction because of their past history with their government. Puerto Ricans tend to be Democratic, vote Democrat. They also have this weird relationship with the U.S. federal government. You know, they're citizens, but they can't vote unless they're on the mainland. And then also, you know, the U.S. treats them as a colony, which they essentially are. Dominicans tend to be Democrat. You move to the West Coast, most Mexicans, most Guatemalans, and most El Salvadorians tend to vote Democrat, with a few exceptions. But let me explain why they vote Democrat. Mexicans don't flee Mexico because of their government. Guatemalans don't flee Guatemala because of their government. El Salvadorians don't flee because of their government. Although there was a time when El Salvadorians did leave because of the Civil War, which was funded by the U.S. Side note. So, so here we can compare and contrast. Cuban and Venezuelans leave because of government. Anything that looks like communism, they outright reject, which means they tend to lean much more Republican. Latinos on the West Coast, which are Mexicans and Central Americans, flee because of violence or a better life. You know, a Mexican man might immigrate up here to work, to send money back to his family in Mexico. Kathy and I helped sponsor, and I wrote a letter of recommendation for a Guatemalan woman who fled with her 2 children because the police there in that specific town were threatening violence upon her if she wasn't, you know, paying them money. And I mean, she was a single mom, so she walked with her children all through Mexico, landed in Texas, separated her children for forever, and you know, pretty terrible. So that's kind of a good example of what I'm talking about. El Salvador, lots leave because of gang violence, and that gang violence came from the U.S. MS-13 is an LA gang, which some of those members were deported by the U.S. and then it took root in there, and so a lot of that's for, you know, it's for an American gang known as MS-13. So they flee for the same reason. Now there are exceptions to the West Coast. So we have to remember, prior to the Mexican-American War, that much of the western, southwest U.S. was Mexico. I mean, Texas was Mexico. New Mexico was Mexico. Arizona, you know, Mexico. Parts of Utah were Mexico. So when Mormons fled Nauvoo, Illinois, they were planning on landing in a country that was not the United States. But when they got there, because the Spanish or the Mexican-American War, that was not part of the U.S. So they actually didn't end up leaving the U.S. like they had planned. And so those families that had been in the United States before it was the United States, they don't readily identify with first generation, second generation immigrant families and their plight. They don't see themselves as that. And the other thing is, studies have shown that a third generation Latino Americans, Mexican Americans, I'm talking about Mexican Americans, Guatemalans, and El Salvadorians, they don't identify as much with their country of their grandparents and their parents. They don't go, their parents haven't taken them to cultural events. So they don't have that connection to, say, Mexico that they used to have. That their earlier parents and grandparents had at one time. And so they also, by third generation, also don't really identify with the plight of the Mexican immigrant, with the Guatemalan immigrant, the El Salvadorian immigrant. They don't see themselves as that. They're different, right? They don't have the cultural connection anymore. Some people like that are called Chicanos. There's a lot of meaning to the word Chicano, different ones. I, for one, I'm a Chicano. My mother was a Guatemalan immigrant. I'm a second generation immigrant. I was raised white, so growing up I didn't have a big connection to the Latino community. And I now, because of some work I've done, I have a much stronger connection with that. So, Cubans, Venezuelans, Republicans flee because of government. Mexicans, El Salvadorians, Guatemalans flee either because of violence or just for a better life. Citizens of the United States that were living in the United States before the United States, such as Mexicans in, New Mexico, Arizona, up California, they've been here forever. They don't see themselves as the immigrant coming up through the Mexican-American border. By the third generation, Latino immigrants from Mexico, Guatemala, and El Salvador, they no longer identify with that country. That nationality isn't a thing anymore, even though they might have the last name Lopez. And they don't attend the cultural events. So they also don't see themselves as having the same issue as the plight of the immigrant. Other thing you have to think about, those of you who have Mexican friends, Guatemalan friends, think about how many of them own their own business. There's a very high percentage. This also explains partially the Latino vote for Trump in 2016. They saw the same reason some white people voted for him. They saw him as a businessman, that he would help business, right? And it's much easier to do that if you're disconnected from the nationality of your grandparents. And then for the Venezuelans, one other important thing for them was that Maduro, who won the presidency in Venezuela, Donald Trump doesn't like that. The Trump administration doesn't like that, which for Venezuelans is very important. So that pushes them even further into the Republican camp. And anyways, that's my hypothesis of why Latinos vote the way they do. They tend, we have to remember Latino, well, it's a made-up word. Hispanic's a made-up word. It's an American word. So if you were in Ecuador, you're talking to a guy and asked them if they were Latino, they'd be like, what are you talking? No, I'm Ecuadorian. So people from Spanish, the Spanish-speaking countries of the Americas, they identify not as Latino, but they identify by nationality, Mexican, Cuban, Chilean, Argentinian, things like that. And so the idea of Latino is an American construct, which I'll probably talk about in another episode. And so with the 2020 race, we've seen Biden and Kamala Harris do very little to grab the Latino vote. And at this moment, it appears that they're being treated the same way Black Americans are. That is, who else are the Black Americans going to vote for, really? Are they really going to vote Republican? And so we find Latinos being treated the same way. The unique difference between the two is that for most Black Americans, they all carry ancestral blood that were slaves that were stolen from Africa. And because they've been here for so many centuries, there is some common culture that is specifically Black American culture. You can't really say the same for Latinos. I mean, right? Argentinians, they think ketchup is spicy. Sure, everyone speaks Spanish. They tend to be Catholic, things like that. But because they don't have this long history in the United States like Black Americans do, they tend not to always vote the same, and maybe not even vote in their best self-interest, to be frank. Which with Black Americans, they are very pragmatic. They know they're probably not getting a candidate that's best for them, so they're gonna get the one that's the least worst for them. And then so they vote for their own needs. And so it's silly when like white Americans thank a Black American for their vote, because Black women don't organize for the white people. They're organizing for themselves. So that's the end of episode 1. I hope it was helpful. Like I said, a couple of white friends asked me about the politics of the Latino communities here in the U.S. All right. Thursday night, 11:06 Pacific Standard Time. See what happens. Oh, sorry, forgot something. In comparison to Biden and Kamala, who have done very little to campaign for the Latino vote, so where does it sound Trump has? And I wouldn't be surprised if Trump gets more Latino votes in 2020 than he did in 2016. But we'll see.
Mestiza soy, contradicción atroz, voy con 4 colores del maíz en mi color.